My goal for you guys and my goal for myself is to help you guys separate fact from emotion. That's what we have to do. We have to be able to separate the fact from emotion, because that's what's going to give us the clearest depiction on whether or not the actions of Derek Chauvin were right, wrong, or indifferent. And so, that's my sole purpose and sole goal of this podcast episode. Yo, what's going on? Welcome to another episode of the It's Needed podcast, where we discuss real issues involving law enforcement in the community. It's your boy Ryan Tillman, founder of Breaking Bears United, and I'm joined today by the light-skinned wonder himself, Mr. Oh No, it's the Popo. What's going on, bro?
I can't call it, brother. What's up with you?
Oh man, it had froze, bro. Like literally, it had froze.
That's not a good sign.
Right at the moment where it said, "What's going on with you, bro?" and it literally froze. I was like,
"Yeah, that's not a good sign. That's
okay,
not a good sign."
Okay.
But yeah, I'm good, brother. How are you?
Doing good. And we are also joined by the Savage himself, Mr. Billy Stuckman. What's going on, Billy?
Billy's Burb over here. So
Billy's Burb. I like that. I like that.
Gotta listen to the last podcast to know what he's talking about.
Yeah, today's my wife's due date and still no baby, so we're on standby.
So that means we need to rush this podcast, because at any moment now she can come or he can come. So right. So man, shout out to little baby Stuckman in the womb. It was funny because did you see the picture I sent you a couple weeks back when I was with Billy's current baby?
Yeah, the selfie.
Yeah, I was like, look at me and Billy Jr. This is what Billy looked like when he was younger. But anyways, man, hey, before we get into today's episode, I really, really want to give a shout out to all of our listeners and followers and subscribers. Last episode was highly downloaded, and so we appreciate you. I mean, all of our episodes for the most part are pretty highly downloaded, but for whatever reason, last episode we had a spike in our downloads, and so that was really, really cool. And we also saw an increase in a lot of our reviews that we got. So I really appreciate you guys. Continue to leave those reviews for us, because those reviews truly do matter. It helps us change up our content if we do, and it also allows us to know what you guys want to hear and what you guys want to listen to. So we appreciate those. So keep those comments coming. 5-star ratings, 5-star reviews on any podcast platform where you listen to us. So I wanted to give you guys that shout out. And before we also move forward, I also wanted to send my prayers and thoughts out to all the family members that of some of the officers that just recently lost their life in the line of duty. Most recently with the officer from the Capitol who was killed by a guy that ran into him with the vehicle at the Capitol. Obviously we had Officer Talley and then some other officers that lost their life in the line of duty. So my thought and prayers go out to them and their families. And, these are some trying times. And so I can only imagine what it's like for them right now.
Yeah, no, absolutely, man. Absolutely hit the nail right on the head with that. The interesting thing about the Capitol is there was like some controversy between two parties, whether they were going to keep that barrier up or down, because how it appeared or whatnot. So luckily it was there, because there's no telling the damage that would have been caused if it wasn't there. So
exactly. COVID update, sounds like they are opening things up more here in California. So It seems like week by week, man, everything's starting to open back up. So that's pretty nice. I don't know if it's the same for you guys out in Ohio.
Our governor set like some number, like if we hit this number, or if we get down to this number, then I'll open it up, which was kind of funny, because we're like, okay, we got to get to this number.
Oh, thank you, sir, for our basic human rights.
That's pretty much how people are feeling right now. His name is Governor DeWine, so they call him Daddy DeWine. We're like, oh, we got to do what Daddy says.
Oh, man.
But you know how that goes.
Yep, man. It's kind of funny watching politics, man, and just seeing how things operate, man. It's so crazy, because it really feels like all of our politicians, no matter whether they're left or right, bro, they look like little kids, or sound like little kids just bickering back and forth. And I'm like, do they even care about the American people, or is this more about their political agendas? Because that's what it really seems like it's turned into.
That's very true. That is very true. And the amount of bickering and the lack of logic is very concerning. It's like, I'm going to prove I'm right, even if deep down inside I know that I'm not right, or maybe my motive for me being right is completely wrong. No matter how much logic you have and no matter how many facts you present, like we're going to go back and forth until you get tired of hearing me, or I just pull the I have more authority than you card.
Yeah. Yeah, so we're not going to get too deep into politics just because it's not worth
We
my
don't want
time.
Billy to
And,
explode.
yeah, Billy's going to get mad and stuff like that. He's going to break out of his shirt like he has before. So not going to do that. But what we are going to do, this is going to be unique. This is going to be part one of maybe a 3-part series. We'll see how long it goes, and you guys will understand why I say that here in a second. But this is going to be a unique episode simply because what we want to do is we want to start discussing the George Floyd trial. And the reason we decided we wanted to discuss the George Floyd trial is because, as we all know, the incident regarding the death of George Floyd last summer really sparked unrest not only in our country but around the rest of the world, involving the way law enforcement does its practices. And we saw so much controversy behind this situation. We saw so much social unrest. We saw, movements like defund the police. We saw movements abolish the police. That really all came from this one moment in our nation's history with the death of George Floyd. And so now with that death, we are currently in the midst of the trial of Officer Chauvin, who is the one who had his knee on his back. And so some might ask, why is this such a controversial trial? Well, the reason it's so controversial in many ways is, one, because this really, catapulted this country into a chain of events that we've never really seen to the scale that it was. I mean, I think the last time we've ever had any social unrest as such, would arguably be the civil rights movement. Some would say Rodney King, but the thing I think that's different about this and Rodney King was you didn't see a whole nation go into unrest during Rodney King. You saw parts, different, hot spots across the country, but nothing like we've seen with George Floyd. And in the civil rights movement, that was a country and versus a set of people and vice versa, meaning African Americans. So I think arguably, this was the first time we've seen any type of unrest of this to this scale, this degree since the civil rights movement. So, and then the reason I think that makes the trial so controversial is because of certain word plays and certain charges that have been filed against Officer Chauvin. So, you'll have terms like manslaughter, murder, second degree manslaughter, and all these different things. And so prior to law enforcement, when I didn't know anything about the laws, I just assumed murder was if somebody dies at the hands of somebody else, that was murder, which now being a police officer, it's not. Same thing like I would assume before law enforcement that if I walked into a store and stole a piece a Snickers and walked out, I would just think that that's theft. But technically, depending on how the laws are written and the elements of the crime, it can be a burglary. And so I think it's very important to really talk about some of these laws in depth to lay the foundation of what this trial, what the arguments are going to be about. And in the subsequent episodes, what we'll do is we'll actually get into some of the testimonies of key witnesses that have been going on. So go ahead, AJ.
And even talking to people who were around during Rodney King, the comparison between seriousness and violence is uncomparable. And like you said, it's worldwide. Rodney King really rocked the nation and changed a lot of policies and procedures that police officers follow over across the U.S. And it may have spilled into neighboring countries. But the George Floyd incident really rocked the world. I mean, there were protest riots and demonstrations worldwide. I mean, I had people, messaging me from Canada, Mexico, Spain, the UK, you name it. And there were just demonstrations everywhere. So you're right. To this degree, I don't think we've seen it in a very, very, very long time. Do you remember where you were at when you first seen the video, Ryan?
Yeah, actually. And I think I texted you that morning. I had woke up and I just saw, I went on Instagram. Yeah, I hate to say one of the first things I did was get on Instagram, but I got on Instagram and I just remember seeing the picture of this officer with his knee on the neck of George Floyd, which at the time I didn't know it was George Floyd. So I saw it starting to circulate and it picked up steam very, very quickly. And so I think what was so hard to watch about that video was I think the video lasted, or the whole incident from the time he was on his back till the time that he got off it was about 8 minutes and 6 seconds, I think. I can't remember the exact time.
9 minutes, 29 seconds.
So 9 minutes, 29 seconds. And I think that's what made it so difficult. But as we start to unpeel or unpack the layers to this whole incident, you start to hear and understand, certain elements to this whole story. And so the disclaimer for this podcast, as you listen to it, is that me and AJ and Billy, we are not, lawyers. We are not legal experts from the standpoint of how things work in criminal trials or nothing like that. But we do have a level of experience when it comes to enforcing the laws, the grounds that we can enforce the laws, and how certain things play out in court and certain things on wordplay. And so we are giving you guys our opinion. This is just simply our opinion, nothing more. It's no legal testimony or nothing like that. We're just giving you our opinion about how all this stuff is unplaying and unfolding. And so we want you guys to remember that when you hear it. And the reason I say that is because if you guys hear something that you may not agree with, or you hear something that might be slightly off base of facts, that you determine at a later time, hey, no harm, no foul. You can shoot us a DM, a message, and say, hey, look, this is what it actually really was. And we'll come out and correct ourselves later if that's the case, for the most part, because this is not about saying, no, this is what it is, this is what it should be. This is just our opinion coming from two guys that are currently police officers and how we've seen things play out based off of our training and experience. That's all it is.
Yeah, and just to touch on that a little bit more, what we're going to try our best to do on this podcast and the future ones regarding this, and really every podcast that we do, is give you the facts, like give you the meat and potatoes of what's going on, and then use our expertise in whether it's personal or professional expertise or life experience to kind of form our opinions and break those down for you a little bit more. So what we're going to do this episode is we're just going to lay the foundation. We're going to tell you who the parties were involved, kind of what happened, the charges and everything, just to give you a good foundation. And then moving forward, we're going to break down the trial, testimonies, rebuttals, anything that happens, the highlights, and really kind of focus on that, and then form our opinions based off of that going into it. Billy, real quick, do you remember where you were when you first saw the video?
It was also on Instagram. I saw that Ryan shared the photo, that initial photo, to the BBU Instagram page. So that's the first place I saw it.
And our account started blowing up. And I actually want to touch on that right quick before we move forward. But before I do that, I do want to say one thing, because that was our disclaimer that we gave for us. I have a disclaimer for you guys. The disclaimer for you guys that are watching or listening to this is that you listen to this with an open mind and open heart. And that's all we ask. And the reason I said it is because when you listen to it from a unbiased, open mind, open heart place, it allows you to learn and allows you to move forward and stuff like that. That's kind of what we need to be doing as human beings. So we did the same thing with Breonna Taylor. We did the same thing with Jacob Blake. We just asked you guys to just have an open mind and open heart. So getting back to what Billy was saying, when I saw that video and when I saw what happened, I didn't really need much information to know that this was wrong. So I'll start there. But what I did say is, in my initial post, I had said like this was murder. I said something like that. And looking back at it, do I want to say I was wrong for that? I don't know if I want to say I was necessarily wrong, because it was definitely wrong of what Chauvin did, no doubt about it. But I think, and I'll be the first to admit that maybe my word choice could have been different, just because I didn't allow due process to do what it's supposed to do, is give the person due process. And so for that, I will openly apologize, say, what, maybe I should have slowed down in saying this was murder, just because I didn't allow due process to take its course. If it's determined later to be murder, then it is what it is. But I kind of went against my own philosophy and basically crucified somebody before the process allowed it to. And the reason I did that was because, again, I am human just like everybody else. I allow my emotions to take over when I saw that video, simply because I put my family member or friend in the position of George Floyd. Regardless of who this guy was, regardless of what his character was, regardless of what he did or anything like that, I looked at it as wrong, knowing as an officer that something could have been done to either prevent this or maybe prolong his life expectancy than it was in that video. And the reason I say prolong it is because we're going to get into the details of why it may not have been the knee that actually killed him, but other things that were underlying. So with that, AJ, I'm going to let you I'm going to turn it over to you to kind of give a roundabout summary of the events that led up to that day, or of that day.
Yeah, I'm actually glad that you said what you just said. Just the reason why I asked both of you if you remember where you were at the first time you saw the video was to kind of just lay the foundation of how serious this incident was and how big of an impact it really had on the world. And the reason I say that is, if you ask really anyone around right now, if you remember the exact location of where you saw something else, what's the other thing that's going to pop in your mind?
9/11.
9/11. And we know the impact that had, not only on us as a nation, but on the world. And George Floyd, I'm not going to compare the two because I don't want to kind of go down that route. But when we talk about the severity and the impact that it has, I would argue that it's up there. And this is just a prime example, right? Like everyone that I've talked to remembers exactly where they were at, what they were doing when they first saw that video. So it just kind of goes to show you the impact that it's having worldwide. So to dive into this, I first want to lay the foundation of who the two main parties were. There were a lot of other people involved that will kind of come to get to know as we go on through future podcasts. But for now, we're going to focus on George Floyd and Derek Chauvin. George Floyd being a 46-year-old male black. He was a security guard who recently lost his job due to COVID. Derek Chauvin being a 45-year-old male white, Minneapolis, I mess that word up all the time, so excuse me if I butcher it, police officer since 2001. These two collide on the date of May 25th, 2020, when George Floyd attempts to pass a fake $20 bill at a store. The clerk immediately identifies the bill as being fake. He calls the police. The police respond. There are reports that he was combative and resistant. I said that way because we'll kind of break that down either later this podcast or a future one. They end up handcuffing George Floyd, placing him face down, and Officer Derek Chauvin places his knee on George Floyd's neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. During that time, there are bystanders who have their cell phones out and are recording the footage that we've all seen. I think it's safe to assume that we've all seen. But the significance behind it is during that time, George Floyd's making statements such as, "I can't breathe, your knee's on my neck, sir, I can't breathe, I can't breathe." And I don't know the exact amount of times that he said that. But it was up there. George Floyd ultimately ended up losing his life. The reason being is, or the cause of death, should I say, is kind of being argued right now during trial, which we'll talk about as well. Derek Chauvin was fired. He was actually charged. We'll talk about those charges later. And it sparked civil unrest and riots and protests worldwide, so much so that the department that I work for, I was on the front line during the demonstration, and I took a scooter, resulting in a torn rotator cuff, and I'm still off work. And Minneapolis and Columbus are nowhere near each other. So just to kind of give you an example of what happened.
So thanks for laying that foundation. And one of the things that we have to do with any video that we see is we always have to remove the emotional side out of things from the very beginning. Like I said, I've made a mistake. We've all made those mistakes, because you see a lot of these videos and they're hard to watch, especially when you put your own family member in the position of the person that was either beat up or killed, and in this case being George Floyd. And so the reason you have to remove your emotional attachment to that video or whatever incident it is because when you have the emotion in there, it clouts the picture of what's real and what's not. And so once you remove that emotion, now we have to do is we have to look at, okay, what is factual about this whole incident? What is it that we are really arguing over to determine whether or not he's guilty of murder or secondary murder and stuff like that? And so we'll bring in the drug part of it later. But the way I'm going to do this, the way I'm going to best describe this is I'm going to really break down two things that officers have to use as a resource anytime they're enforcing a law. You have, here in California, it's called the Penal Code. So you have the California Penal Code, and within that Penal Code, you have the elements of a crime. So those are two separate things that I really need to identify. And so the best way to give you an example is, for example, you have the crime of burglary, and then underneath burglary, you have a set of elements of burglary. And what the elements are the things that have to happen in order for it to be a legit burglary. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give Billy an example right now. And I'm going to use, this is actually an old example of an older law, because this law has been updated. So for those of you guys who are California peace officers, when you guys hear this, you guys are going to be like, well, that's not the law anymore. Yeah, it's not the law anymore. The law has since changed, but I want to use it as an example because it's really going to identify an example of how you determine what the elements of a crime are. bar. So Billy, if I told you that let's just say you entered Walmart and you didn't have any money in your wallet, you didn't have any credit cards on you, and you didn't have a job, and I knew all these different things, and you went into Walmart and you stole a Snickers, and then you walked out. And when you walk out, a police officer contacts you outside the store. Is it a theft or is it a burglary?
I don't know the difference between the definitions, but trying to read between the lines, I'm guessing that's theft. And burglary maybe needed to have like pre-thought planning going into it. That's what I'm guessing.
Perfect. So I love this. So he's guessing a theft. Now, up until a few years ago in California, that would technically be classified as a burglary. Here's why, is because we can prove that your intent was to go into that store and steal a Snickers because you didn't have any money in your wallet. We knew you didn't have a job. So there's no way to really predetermine that you had the idea that you didn't walk into Walmart and then all of a sudden say, oh, I'm gonna steal a Snickers. You knew you walked into Walmart with the idea and with the intent to steal something, knowing you didn't have a way to paying for that Snickers bar. Does that make sense? And so let's say you did have $1 in your pocket and you did have a job and you walked in there, you stole a Snickers and walked out, it would be hard to prove the intent. Your intent was to steal that Snickers bar before you walked into that store. And so therefore, same exact thing, but you had a wallet, you have money, you had a job, you walk in and you take that Snickers bar. It's hard to argue that your intent was that. So then we would charge you for theft, which would be the difference of felony and a misdemeanor. Burglary is a felony. Theft is a misdemeanor. So I use that example to really describe how difficult it is to prove a person's intent. So when you talk about killing and you talk about murder, that was the thing that I had a hard time grasping before I became a police officer, because, if you say, somebody murdered somebody, I'm thinking they killed somebody. Well, anybody can kill somebody. I can go get in my car today, get in a car accident and kill somebody. But to murder somebody, that means you actually have to have the intent to go out there. You have to have malice aforethought and essentially go out there and commit this heinous act and pre-plan this. It has to be premeditated. Therefore, you murdered somebody. So some might ask, why is all of this important right now? The reason it's important is because initially, when all this came out, everybody, including myself, was like, oh, this guy murdered George Floyd and everything like that. Well, in order for it to be a legitimate murder, you have to prove the intent that Derek Chauvin had to murder George Floyd. That is a very, very hard thing to do. And so I'll let you get into the charges of what they actually charged George Floyd with, AJ, and then we'll actually kind of break that down.
Actually, Billy, can you read off the charges that you put on the notes that you have? Sorry to put you on the spot there.
Yeah, no problem. I got them right here. So George Floyd was charged with second-degree unintentional murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter. And I also have the definitions if you guys want me to give that.
Please read those.
So second-degree unintentional murder causes the death of a human being without intent to affect the death of any person, while intentionally inflicting or attempting to inflict bodily harm upon the victim.
Excellent. Okay. Next one.
Third-degree murder requires prosecutors to prove that someone caused the death of another by perpetrating an act eminently dangerous to others and evincing a depraved mind without regard for human life. And then what was the last one? Second-degree manslaughter. Prosecutors will need to show beyond a reasonable doubt that he was culpably. I can't say any of these words, by the way, so I apologize.
That's why we're not attorneys. That's why we're not attorneys.
Culpably negligent and took an unreasonable risk with Floyd's life when he restrained him, and that his actions put Floyd at risk of death or great harm.
Perfect. So the reason those are so important, and I'll turn it over to AJ in a second, but the reason those are so important is we need to know the definitions of, one, we need to know what he was charged for. Two, we need to know the definitions. And once you know the definitions, then you go to the elements of those crime. And that crime, and I want you to do this. If you're listening to this, I want you to look up for yourself what he was charged for and then look up the elements. So the way you do that is you can go on to Google and then type in that crime, whatever it is, and then it will actually show the definition of that crime. And then you yourself, through deductive reasoning, can start to determine whether or not Derek Chauvin's intent was to murder him. Was it manslaughter? Was it negligence? You can start to decipher based off of the testimonies of what people were saying, what you believe his intent was, and that will carry you to your own verdict. And so go ahead, AJ, you say that to turn over to AJ.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's also important for us to break down Graham versus Connor, which is the case law that allows officers to use force. Once again, you can hop on Google, you can look it up. I'm not going to bore you with the facts, or not the facts, but the like all the details about what Graham versus Connor is. But there are things called the Graham versus Connor factors, and these are things that we need to run through our minds and our brains when we're dealing with somebody combative or when we're going to use force. And I'll just break those down for you really quick. The first of which is there's a threat to an officer or a threat to somebody else. So if I approach Ryan or Billy and I can articulate that Ryan's actions are a threat to Billy, then I could use reasonable force to detain him or to stop his actions. If I can articulate that his actions are going to cause me bodily harm or himself bodily harm, I could do the exact same thing. Active resistance is another factor. So if I'm trying to legally place him under arrest or detain him and he's passively or actively resisting, I could also use force, the necessary force to detain him or to stop him from doing that. The severity of the crime at hand. So, if Ryan or Billy just killed someone, I know that to be true, then I'm allowed to approach the situation a little bit differently than if he just jaywalked. And then the other one is he is attempting to evade by flight. Or there are rapidly evolving circumstances. So I just want you to keep in mind while we talk about this as well. I also have the severity of the crimes listed here and what Officer Chauvin, I'm going to mess his name up as well, is facing. So the second degree murder has a potential sentence of 10 to 15 years. The third degree murder has a potential sentence of 10 to 15 years. And then the second degree manslaughter has a potential sentence of 41 to 57 months.
And so with that being said, one of the things we have to prepare ourselves for is the verdict. And the reason we have to prepare ourselves for the verdict is because if for whatever reason Derek Chauvin is convicted of manslaughter instead of murder, there's going to be a lot of upset people because in their mind, they just think when one guy causes the death of another person, it's automatically murder when that's not the case. And that's because of the way things are broken down in the intent of a person. And so that's why we're doing all of these thorough breakdowns of what laws are, what the elements are, is because we want you guys, whenever they come to that verdict, we want you to understand how they may have arrived to that verdict. And also know that the jury is also being schooled up as to what they should, render him guilty on or not, or innocent of. So that being said, let's move into the actual situation of George Floyd and Officer Chauvin. And so when Officer Chauvin arrives on scene, they contact George initially. And mind you, they had prior contacts with George in the past for different incidents. And the reason that's important to notate is just because in my day job, there are times where you'll go out with certain people multiple times. I always like to call them frequent flyers. And anytime you deal with people frequently, you start to learn their behaviors or tendencies and things like that. And so if you have somebody that's always going to usually fight with you, you kind of come into that situation a little bit different, knowing that they might fight with you. If you come in knowing that this guy is always on drugs and taking some crazy stuff, it might change the way you think and stuff like that. So they had prior contacts with George Floyd. They initially they contact George Floyd, who's actually in his vehicle in the initial body cam that I saw. Now, one would argue that, Officer Chauvin kind of came to him a little bit more of verbally aggressive. I remember watching the video and I think, maybe it could have been de-escalated a little bit more just based on how he was talking to him. But that's all hearsay, or that's all, not hearsay, but it's all subjective thinking. Just because as officers, we all do our jobs differently. Some are a little bit more heavier handed than others. Some are a little bit more lenient than others. And so that's all subjective. But ultimately what ends up happening is they get George Floyd out of that vehicle, and then they, at some point in time, they go ahead and try to take him into custody. Now, what people don't realize, or some may, but I guess George Floyd, I guess it was known that, or it was brought up that he didn't like being in close quarters. What's that called again? Claustrophobic. And so they said, when they're taking him into custody and they're trying to put him into the police vehicle, in the back of the police vehicle, he starts resisting and trying to fight because he doesn't want to get back in there. And he says he's claustrophobic. At one point in time, I think he says he can't breathe while they're putting him in the back of the police car because he said he just had COVID, which I think it was later confirmed that he did have COVID in the past. But he's saying these things. So why would officers, we got to ask ourselves the question, why would officers continue to try to force somebody into a back of a police car if they're saying they can't breathe, or they're saying they just had COVID. Now, again, this is all giving you experience based off my own personal experience as a police officer. There are times where people say they can't breathe. There are times where people will fight. There are times where people will say they are going through medical crisis. We should treat them as such every single time. However, when you're dealing with people, frequent flyers that like this is their thing, there are a lot of times that people will lie to you just because they're trying to get out of whatever they're going through. They don't want to get in the back of a police car. They'll tell you, hey, look, I got this, when they really don't have it because they're trying to avoid getting arrested or whatever it may be. So was this one of those situations where, Derek Chauvin and his partners felt like, hey, he's just pulling this nonsense? And one of the reasons I bring it up is because you can actually hear in the body cam video when George Floyd says, I can't breathe, and Chauvin says, if you can talk, you can breathe. That's not uncommon for officers to say to people when they're taking them into custody, simply because I've had that happen before where people say, I can't breathe, and they're talking to me. And so somebody say, well, if you can talk, you can breathe. So yeah, it may not sound right. Maybe that's not the best thing to say, but the reason I bring it up is because that also goes into the mindset of those officers. Were they thinking that he's just saying that he's just lying, because we know how it's typical George. He's saying that he can't breathe when he's just trying to avoid arrest, or was he being serious in this time? And so as officers, one thing I will say, especially learning from this incident, because we should always try to learn from past incidents, no matter what a person says, no matter how many frequent flyer miles they have with us, we should always try to take them serious until proven otherwise, because we don't want it to be a situation that ends in the death of somebody because they were really going through a medical emergency. So they fast forward, they try to get him in the car, and then they put him on the ground. But I see you got something, AJ. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna, I guess, voice an opinion really quick, and I'm gonna let you know that it's my opinion before I say it. But I think that it's important for people to hear. It's been my experience that putting a knee on someone's upper body, whether it's their neck, head, chest, shoulder, upper back, up until that point has also been common practice. What separates the George Floyd incident from a lot of instances that I've seen and or know of is the amount of time that the knee was there. I would say a majority of officers are trained, or at least once again from my experience, what I've seen is you put your body weight there to kind of control the combativeness or the resistance. You control the subject, whether you put shackles on their ankles, you put them in handcuffs, whatever you have to do, and then you immediately turn them to their side so they could breathe. And there was actually an officer on scene who said that during that incident. I think he was one of the probationary officers. He made the statement. He goes, hey, should we move him to a side? And Officer Chauvin said he stays where he's at. And then that officer even goes on to say, like, oh, I was just worried about the positional I must have messed this up too.
Positional asphyxiation.
Boom, there you go, my man. That's why you're my brother.
AJ's an overachiever. I hadn't even got to the ground yet.
Oh, my bad. I'm all over the place,
good.
man.
No, that's good though. So they take him out of the car because he wouldn't get in the car. And so they take him out of the car, and then they place him on the ground. And mind you, he's in handcuffs already. So when they get him on the ground, 3 officers basically control them by putting their body weight on him, on his back, or he's on his stomach, and they put their Derek Chauvin puts his knee across the neck / upper torso area or upper back area. One is in the middle, one is at the legs. Is this a common practice? We have to ask ourselves, it is common practice by police officers. This is common practice. I've done this before. And the reason, like AJ said, is you want to be able to control the position and the positional movement of a person, especially if they're fighting. And the reason that is because even if a person is in handcuffs, can they be a threat? Yes. I've actually had partners get kicked. I've had a guy with steel-toe boots before that was handcuffed kick out our doors because he has steel-toe boots on. And so we want to be able to control, we want to put ourselves as police officers in a position of advantage to limit a person's movement. And so it is common practice for officers to divide the body up like that in halves and use their body weight on a person to control them. Now, what we get into now is at what point in time do we check on the well-being and remove him from his stomach to, reevaluate. And we talked about this in the past, I think when this first came out, but this is where you start deviating from your policy. So when we talk about violating policy, and which the chief in this case has testified saying that he violated policy, well, where's the violation in policy, we might ask? Well, the violation in policy, if you ask me, comes from this. when you have control over him and you fail to reassess, you fail to reevaluate, you fail to see if this person actually needs some medical attention, I think that's where you start getting into the violation of policy and into the negligence side of things, because at that point in time, you are now not doing what you're trained to do. So the way we train is, if a person tells us I can't breathe, or if a person claims they're going through a medical emergency, what you want to do is you want to put that person on their side into a position of recovery and allow them to get air, because the last thing you want a person to do is suffocate or have positional asphyxiation, because all of our body weight is on them. And so what we didn't see in that video is we didn't see them reevaluate or reassess and turn him on his side, especially when you have a probationer saying, hey, look, should we turn him on his side? And you just negate that fact and say, we're going to leave him right here. So that's where the negligence comes in. But can we at that moment in time now say that his intent, Derek Chauvin's intent, was to murder him? That's hard. And so what I want to do is I want to transition into talking about what also escalated the situation, because right now, if you listen to what we've been saying, everything we've set up into this point, we haven't even mentioned the fact that he was under the influence of drugs. This is just his actions, his outwardly actions towards the officers and what caused him to do what they did. But we have not talked about how things change when a person is under the influence of drugs. And what we now know from the toxicology report is that George Floyd was actually under the influence of fentanyl. So let's talk about this idea of being under the influence of fentanyl, and let's also talk about excited delirium, because excited delirium might be a term that might be new to you, or if you are a new police officer, this might be something that you've learned about but you're still not familiar with it. So let's talk about that. Go ahead, AJ.
So I'll just read the definition of excited delirium. It's also known as agitated delirium. It's a syndrome described as a combination of psychomotor, agitation, delirium, and sweating. It may include attempts at violence, unexpected strength, and very high body temperature. Complications may include a really big word that I'm not even going to try to say, or high blood pressure. Something that's important to note is that a lot of times it is caused by drug usage. And I will just kind of give you AJ's definition, which will not be as smooth as that was. It makes you completely out of your mind and violent. It gives you super strength. I mean, you could lift a car, you're covered in sweat, so you're kind of hard to control. And it's just something that's very dangerous because you pose a danger to yourself and others. And it's also hard for us to control you because we can't grab you. You're covered in sweat. You're kind of out of your mind. Your body temperature is through the roof. Your heart rate's through the roof. Your blood pressure's through the roof. So if you're not only a danger to yourself because of your actions, but now you're a danger to yourself because of what you ingested or because what your body is experiencing as well. So I'll also read the first autopsy. It's important to note that there have been two autopsies. The first of which, let me pull this up here because I don't want to just, give you AJ's opinion on this. It was conducted by Andrew Baker, and this was May of 26. And the finding was his final autopsy finding was issued June 1st, and he found that Floyd's heart stopped while he was being restrained and that his death was a homicide caused by cardiopulmonary arrest, complicating law enforcement subdual, restraint, and net comprehension. This is where it gets important, though. It goes on to say that fentanyl intoxication and recent methamphetamine use may have increased the likelihood of death. The amount of fentanyl measured in his system was 11 nanograms per milliliter. So I'm not going to pretend to know what that measure of fentanyl is.
It equates that you can kill a horse with that.
That's what I was going to say. I will say this, and once again, I won't even say this is opinion because this is something that I've been trained in. Fentanyl is so dangerous that we are not to touch it barehanded, like with our bare skin, because it can soak into the pores of your skin and officers can overdose. I've been on scene where a coworker of mine actually overdosed because as he was searching a person he was placing under arrest, incident to arrest, he reached in his pocket and unfolded a bubble gum wrapper, and this white powder kind of just trickled down his arm. It soaked into the officer's skin, and he started sweating, fell down to the ground, and overdosed. I shared that just to kind of let you know how strong of a drug this is, and that people actually ingest it as a drug, right? Like they snort it, they lace it with marijuana, they cut it with heroin. It's in meth. They smoke it with meth. They snort it with meth, and it's to make the product stronger, and it's to also help the drug dealer make more money because they now have more product that gets you higher. So yeah, it's important to note that he did have fentanyl on board. He did use meth, and to let you know what the actual finding of the first autopsy was. Now, I don't want to jump too far ahead, but I mentioned that there was two. The second one was the attorneys for George Floyd's family and George Floyd's family actually had a second one on May 29th. And this one was a little different because what it lacked was a toxicology report. There was no toxicology report. And the findings for this one, you have to excuse me here, I'm trying to read through this. Here we go. It was a homicide caused by asphyxia. Help me out with that word, Ryan.
Asphyxiation.
Asphyxiation due to neck and back compressions. Also, Floyd had no underlying medical problem that contributed to his death. The said neck compression affected the blood flow to the brain. Being able to speak does not mean that someone is able to breathe, and Floyd apparently died at the scene. The reason why they put that second part in there is because it goes on to say during the first autopsy that Floyd had underlying heart problems, high blood pressure, hypertension, all of that. So I think that's why they put that in there to kind of combat that. But you can already kind of see the difference in autopsy reports via the two.
And without actually getting into some of the testimonies yet, his girlfriend did testify, and one of the things that his girlfriend said was he wasn't an addict to cocaine and fentanyl and different other drugs and stuff like that. And so the reason that's important to notate is because I truly believe that he was under the influence of drugs, and one of the toxicology reports is congruent with that. And so why is that important to notate? It's because let's just remove the knee on George Floyd's neck or back. Let's just remove that. Is it possible that George Floyd could have died that day if that never even occurred? If you ask me, it's very possible that he could have died, because what it sounds like he was going through an overdose. And through that overdose, obviously, if you're overdosing on drugs, that could cause a lot of other... Oh, you had froze, my bad. If you're going through a person that's going through an overdose, and I've been on many overdoses, some where people make it out and some where don't, many where people don't make it out. It's a scary, crazy scene to see a person take their last gasp of air because all of the air and all the blood circulation is being cut off because of the drug. And so if you remove the actions of the officer, we have to ask ourselves the question, is it possible that he could have died? And you ask me, I would say yes. What I think that Officer Chauvin not getting him the medical treatment sooner than later definitely may have, contributed or made that process go a little bit faster. But we have to ask ourselves at the end of the day, would this have been prevented if they would have turned him on his side or got him medical treatment sooner? And that's pretty much the question that kind of looms over this whole controversial trial. Yep.
You're absolutely right. Something else that I think is important as we lay this foundation before we jump into the trial is there was a lawsuit. And on March 12th of 21, the Minneapolis City Council settled with the Floyd family for $27 million. Now, why is that important? It's important because you could look at that one of two ways. You could look at that as they're admitting guilt. The city council saying, yeah, this officer messed up. Here's a bunch of money. Or you could look at it like, city council just wanted it to be over with and threw money at the family. Either way, it's going to get brought up. It's been brought up until this point. So I just want to put that out there that happened. Once again, I'll give you my opinion on this. This was a very, 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 very high profile case. There were riots, demonstrations, and protests worldwide, especially in Minneapolis. And I would say that kind of played a part into it. I'm not going to say, whether Chauvin was right or wrong. We're going to try to stay away from that. But I will say that I have seen personally where city council or mayor's offices or certain political parties will just say, you know what, I don't want to deal with the headache of this lawsuit. Let's just settle for X amount to get rid of it. And there's all sorts of stipulations they could put into that settlement. We're not going to talk about it. You're not going to release what we paid you. You name it. I've seen it. So I just want to put that out there as well for you to kind of form your own opinion on moving forward.
So one of the last things I want to touch on and as we build the foundation for the testimonies to come is the other players that were involved. So there was 2 other people that were holding George Floyd down. One of them was on probation. And then there was a third person that was blocking the crowd away. And so all of them are going to be under the microscope as well as whether or not they should be fired, whether or not they should be charged. And so one of the things I want to lay out before we even talk about them later on in the trial is that you have to understand that every person involved in this, you have to basically separate everybody else's actions because everybody's perspective is always going to be different. It will. And everybody from the guy that's shooing the crowd away, because you got to think he's looking away. So, I don't know. Maybe we'll find out in trial or body cams, but was he looking back a whole bunch to know that how long he was on his neck or where they turned him on the side? We don't know that, but his perspective was different from the other 2, where you have one that was saying, let's turn him on the side. So we have to separate all these different people. One of the places I learned this from was recently when I went to the officer involved shooting, a retreat. And the reason I learned this is because there was about 4 guys from a department, I won't say the agency, that were all involved in the same shooting. So every single one of those people had shot their firearm at the suspect that was involved. But they all individually told their account of the story. And when they told their account of the story, it was very crazy because a lot of their accounts were very different from the next person. Why? Because they perceived this whole incident from a different perspective, a different lens. Where there's some overlap and where there's some similarities, absolutely there were. But there was also a lot of differences from the way they perceive things. And so we have to kind of take that same type of logic into this case when determining whether or not these guys were right, wrong, or indifferent. So really keep that in mind. So what I will say is that I personally, at this point in time, I think that Derek Chauvin was wrong, but to what extent was he wrong? And this is why I say to what extent. The reason I can go out on a limb and say I think he was wrong to some degree, no doubt about it, is because as an officer with training and experience, having dealt with similar situations, having dealt with people that are under the influence of drugs, under the influence of fentanyl, having dealt with people that we've had to detain in handcuffs and put them on their stomach, and having dealt with people that have told me that they cannot breathe, what I do know is that anytime a person has told me they can't breathe, one of the things that we do immediately is turn them on their side and get them some air or sit them up. We reevaluate, we reassess. The failure to do so in this scenario, I think, is what makes him wrong right now. Now, what comes after that, I don't know. Let's wait for the trial to play out and see. But for that, if we just take that alone, that at the very least makes him wrong because he didn't reassess. And by policy, by police policy, we have a duty to reassess and reevaluate anytime we are using force on any subject in the field. And so that is why I'll go out on a limb and say that I think he's wrong. But I think it's going to be important to figure out and determine based on all the other testimonies to what extent he was wrong. And so these are just a few things that I want you guys to consider as you guys listen or watch this trial, because there's a lot of different things that you're going to have to key in on. And there's a lot of wordplay. I didn't understand how critical wordplay was in law enforcement until I became a police officer. Because words truly do matter in your police report. Words matter in your descriptions, and words matter when you're telling your side of the story as to why you made the decisions that you made. So, and the last thing I want to bring up, that's what I wanted to bring up, is the race aspect of it. One of the things that came from this whole George Floyd incident is it immediately turned into a black and white thing immediately. And why I think we needed to even pump our brakes on that is because in order to, now let me preface this. I think that this was a straw that broke the camel's back. I think living in a country that was once divided, that was once, segregated, that was where there's a lot of racial tension that is derived from the KKK movement to the civil rights movement to Rodney King. I think there's been a lot of different racial tension throughout the years that has caused for this division in our country, with law enforcement kind of being at the forefront of it. And so when this whole George Floyd thing happened, I think it was a straw that broke the camel's back, because you had a white officer kneeling on a black man. Let's just say you replace Derek Chauvin with a black officer. Would we even ever hear about this George Floyd situation? And we have to ask ourselves the question, if we're going to be honest, have we asked ourselves that question? If let's say all three of those officers had been black on the back of George Floyd, would we have ever even heard about this? And if I'm going to be honest, I'm probably going to venture out and say we probably wouldn't. And if we did, it wouldn't be to the exposure that it is. The reason I ask that question is because every single day in law enforcement, you have black officers using force on white people or black people or vice versa, and it doesn't really catch as much steam just because of the color of people's skin. So we have to ask ourselves how this turned into a racial issue, and it turned into a racial issue because you had a white officer on top of a black man. Can the actions of Derek Chauvin been perpetuated by race? That is very, very hard to prove. It could, don't get me wrong, it could absolutely be racial, but how do we prove it? For all I know, Derek Chauvin could have been a racist, neo-Nazi, white supremacist who hangs Nazi flags at his house. But for all I know, he could also be a Christian guy that goes to church every single Sunday, has never had any type of racial prejudices in his life or explicit biases or anything like that. But in order to prove one or the other, you got to be able to go back and look into the person's history, look into their relationships, look into messages that they send, what they say. But for us to classify this as race from day one, the moment we saw that video, that's, I think, where we also went sidetracked too, because we took a situation without knowing all the information and we made it about race as opposed to getting away from the facts of the investigation. And so I also want you guys to keep that in your mind when we're talking about this trial and how we can improve moving forward, so that way not only can we better the system of the criminal justice system, but we can also better the relationship between law enforcement and the community.
Yeah, there's a saying right now, I don't know if you've seen it or not, but I don't think it could be any more true. And the saying is, the world's watching. And I think that's absolutely true. Like, I do believe that the world is really tuned into this case, the trial, the testimonies, everyone involved, because it will affect the outcome of this trial. Will affect not only law enforcement, but every single person that's living right now. Like I said, there were demonstrations worldwide, so everyone's really invested in this. But I'm really excited to do this breakdown. And the reason why we're not diving into week one is because we're on the heels of it right now. We want to really dive into it, do our research, and bring you everything that was said, all the meat and potatoes, all of the facts. We want to bring you a complete package with this. We don't want to just do it halfway. Like, you know how we rock it, like, you know how we get down. So we're not gonna do you that way. We're gonna bring you everything that we can, packaged up really nice. So I'm looking forward to next week when we dive into this trial. There have already been some bombshells, at least for me. When you talk about like the 911 dispatcher and the chief, and the differences in what they did to compare to what's normal and whatnot. So I'm really looking forward to that.
My goal for you guys and my goal for myself is to help you guys separate fact from emotion. Yeah. That's what we have to do. We have to be able to separate the fact from emotion, because that's what's going to give us the clearest depiction on whether or not the actions of Derek Chauvin were right, wrong, or indifferent. And so, we got that's my sole purpose and sole goal of this podcast episode.
You said something really important. I just want to reinforce it towards the beginning of this podcast. Is I really want you, being the listener, to challenge yourself as well. You may hear things that you may not agree with. You may hear things that you love. We may say things that upset you as a police officer. We may say things that upset you as a community member or as a minority or as a, anti-police officer, or anti-law enforcement or anti-government person. But what I want you to do is challenge yourself to just have an open mind while we move forward to this. We're going to try our best to keep our opinions out of it as much as we can. Don't get me wrong. We're going to give you experiences that we've went through. We're going to give you our opinions as far as like professional opinions and maybe some things that we've learned along the way in our personal lives. But we're going to try our best to keep our opinions out of it as much as we can and bring you the facts. But you have to go into it knowing that you may hear some things that upset you, that trigger you and whatnot. But we're going to bring it to you raw. We're going to bring it to you real. We might say some things that offend you. It is what it is. It is what it is.
Billy, do you have anything before we let our audience go?
I don't have anything, but I do have a good one has to go.
Oh,
good.
My man.
I was looking one up right now, so I'm glad because I was going to say one has to go California, Ohio, Florida, or New York.
Oh, California.
Cali,
come on.
for sure.
Yeah. I live here. And
Ohio, bro.
Nah, I
just
still.
Oh my God, Billy, yes.
Well, Billy, how you just gonna dog me out like that? I was playing.
Billy know what's up.
All right, go ahead.
We good?
Yeah,
Okay.
let's move into it.
It's our classic friend, the French fry.
Oh,
So, classic cut, crinkle cut, curly fry, or waffle fry. One has to go.
One more time.
classic
cut, so like Mickey D's.
Yeah.
Yep.
Crinkle, which is usually like the frozen bag, cheaper. Curly fries or waffle fries.
I'm gonna go with crinkle cut.
Okay.
Crinkle cut for sure.
Curly.
Whoa, come on, Billy.
I think curly, it's almost like too much. I feel like a stomachache after like 3. It's too much.
Like
I understand.
Rally's fries.
Billy probably don't season his chicken either, so I understand that.
Definitely not the right way. Definitely not the right way.
I definitely thought crinkle cut. Billy's probably like crinkle cut is number one on his list.
Crinkle cut. It's cheaper and usually you don't enjoy it as much. But I just don't like curly.
So yeah, I don't. So all right. When we think of plain cut, we think of what? McDonald's.
Yeah, McDonald's got some bomb
We
fries.
think of crinkle cut. We think of crinkle cut. We think of who got the crinkle cut fries?
Nobody sells crinkle cut.
The frozen bags.
Yeah, the frozen
grocery
section.
store.
Nah, there's some fast food places.
The frozen
that
section.
Sell, waffle fries, Chick-fil-A.
All day.
So good.
Curly fries, Racks and Rallies.
I was thinking Jack in the Box.
I was thinking Arby's.
Oh, Arby's too.
Arby's, bomb.
Bomb, yeah.
Real good. We can stick with Arby's. Their fries are good.
Hey, Billy said.
Yeah. I think the crinkle gotta go.
Crinkle definitely got to go, bro.
I mean, there's some good crinkle. Don't get me wrong. There's some good crinkle fries out there, but in the grand scheme of things,
Bro, when I think of crinkle fries, I think of the struggle. That's what I think of, bro. I think of crinkle fries on a plate with some fish sticks, bro.
I don't agree with Ryan's statement. I'm gonna just put it out there. If you got crinkle fries, I love and support you. And I'm here for you. All right.
If you eating crinkle fries, don't trip. Stay in the fight. You will get about the struggle. I promise you. It gets better.
Ryan got a hole in his sock right now.
Get off the top around me. Hey, yeah. You see the struggle? The struggle is real. The struggle is real. Oh man, but. Hey, this episode was good, but like we said before, we really appreciate you guys sticking around with us. Last episode was really, really good. Share this episode with people, especially these new episodes to come, just because there's a lot of controversy around this George Floyd. There's a lot of people on one side of the fence, and so if you want
it's gonna get good.
People to hear an unbiased conversation, I will tell you this is where you want to send them and the reason I say unbiased, I can confidently say that because AJ and I have called out a lot of bad police work, no doubt about it. We have called it out before, and we will say when officers are wrong, but at the same time, we also know when officers are right and we do the right thing. And so when I say that if you want to point them in a direction that is not skewed one way or the other, send them here, let them listen, and then let them make the decision on their own. So with that being said, we appreciate y'all. The next time we probably talk, Billy will probably have the baby.
Yep.
I'll probably be.
Billy was confident.
I'll actually be in Florida, so I'll probably be doing the next episode from my room in Florida, and so we won't be in studio, but it will still be good.
We'll make it work. Yep.
And then yeah. So hey, when you going back to work?
I don't know yet. I go back to the surgeon in May. He could very much say you're good to go starting the next day, or he could say I need some more time off, so I'm still kind of up in the air. I'm making really good progress though. I'm making really, really good progress. I'm throwing some weights in there. I could do a push up now.
You looking soft, boy. You looking soft.
Listen, I'm skinny fat right now. I'm skinny fat. I've been running, trying to cut that down a little bit. But hey, your boy is coming back in full effect.
Bro, I did my body fat today, bro, and let's just say I was not pleased. But whatever. Story for a different day.
You plugged it in and it went womp womp.
Nah,
womp.
I was eating too many zingers, bro. Eating too many zingers.
Zingers and crinkle fries.
Hey, Ryan sent. So we have a group chat. It's me, Ryan, and Billy, which is like our podcast group chat, right? Ryan sent us a picture of him working with a can of energy drink and a zinger. Almost, I think it was the next day. So Ryan was not playing when he said that. He really eats zingers,
and they were bomb too when I ate them. So just so y'all know. All right, y'all. Well, we love y'all, and we'll see y'all next week.
Peace.